This video is brought to you by my fantastic supporters over at Patreon. Go to patreon.com/TJTheEmperor to find out how you can support the channel.
And now for our feature presentation.
So, I don't know if any of you are fans of the game show Name That Tune. I guess there's a new version that's been running on Fox for a few years, so maybe some of you watch it? I don't know. Either way, I want to play a quick round of Name That Tune with all of you. I'm going to play less than a second of a song, and I guarantee, no matter who you are, that you're going to know exactly what it is, despite me only playing less than a second. You ready? Alright, here we go. Did you get it? Of course you did. I don't think it's possible for anyone in
Insert current year
not to recognize the Pokémon theme. The mere fact that most of you recognize the song in less than a second demonstrates what a colossal stranglehold Pokémon's had on culture as a whole, and I've been witness to that impact from almost the beginning. The American debut of the Pokémon anime in the late 90s is actually what got me into the medium in general. It was after learning the show was Japanese is when I actively started seeking out any other cartoons from Japan that I could get my hands on, and I literally do mean any.
Oh no!
Pokémon's place in the history of anime may be important, especially in the West, where it got not just me, but an entire generation of other fans into the medium, but its place in the history of video games is even more monumental. The series did not create the subgenre of the monster collecting RPG. Games like Dragon Quest V and the Megami Tensei franchise had already established the tropes of the genre years before, but with the release of the first Pokémon games on the Game Boy in 1996, the monster collecting RPG entered its golden age, with many new franchises following in its wake. There was one issue with this, however. These sorts of games were closely associated with Nintendo hardware, and to be even more specific, Nintendo handhelds. If you wanted to get into monster collecting RPGs in the late 90s, early 2000s, and you didn't own a Game Boy Color, you were kinda shit out of luck. Like, if you had a PlayStation and wanted a piece of the action, what was a guy to do then? Yes, your options were very limited, but even so, there was one game in particular you could turn to that would quench your monster collecting thirst. Jade Cocoon, Story of the Tamamayu, has never been among the brightest stars in the PlayStation's constellation of JRPGs. I mean, to be fair though, this was the console that gave us Final Fantasies 7 through 9 in the span of 3 years, so the competition for that position is a little fierce, to say the least. That said, the game's always retained a small, dedicated fanbase, myself obviously included. My first experience with the game was probably in 2000. A good friend of mine, the same friend who introduced me to Final Fantasy VII back in the day, was playing it when I went over to his house one weekend, and right away I was hooked. Not too long afterwards I got a copy of my own, but despite how much I enjoyed the game, I've never actually finished it. Actually, until making this video, I had still never finished it. A couple of the goals that I set for this channel are to highlight overlooked games and to revisit games I played in the past that I never got around to beating, and with Jade Cocoon, I had an opportunity to do both at once. This isn't going to be any sort of in-depth, spoiler-laden analysis of the game, just a relatively basic review to introduce Jade Cocoon to an audience that may not have had a chance to play it yet. I hope you all enjoy. So, as I mentioned, the original PlayStation was kind of a powerhouse for the RPG genre. That was the case from basically its launch. Some of its earliest notable games were the Kingsfield series and Suikoden, after all. But I think the success of Final Fantasy VII just accelerated that powerhouse status even more, to such an extent that even developers who had never considered making RPGs in the past got in on the action. The creator of Jade Cocoon was one of those developers. The game was made by a company called Genki, who I'm assuming most of my audience is unfamiliar with, not just because they're relatively small, but because their focus tended to be on games that fall well outside the focus of this channel. Early adopters of the original PlayStation may recognize them as the creators of the first-person shooter games Kiliak, say it like a Midwestern idiot, Kiliak, and Epidemic. Or maybe not, considering I don't think either game was ever that popular. But the genre Genki has always been most associated with is racing. If you're familiar with the Tokyo Extreme Racing franchise, which is still in active development, believe it or not, Genki is the studio behind those games. And even outside Tokyo Extreme Racing, most of their other notable titles are racing games as well. Prior to Jade Cocoon's creation, it really didn't seem like RPG development was anything close to a priority for Genki. In fact, if you look at the credits for Gaku Tamura, the game's primary director and scriptwriter, he had never worked on a single RPG prior to Jade Cocoon. He was mostly a graphic designer for those shooters and racing games I had discussed earlier. This admittedly sounds like a recipe for disaster, but reading interviews with Tamura feels like he seemed to take the assignment as something closer to a passion project. We had two goals when making Jade Cocoon. One was to create an immersive story world, and the other was to provide compelling monster-raising gameplay. In this way, the game would be both stylistically and technically unlike anything else on the market. You could almost say that we've created a new genre. Bold claims? Certainly, but Jade Cocoon has enough substance to back them up. Let's start with that immersive story world, as this, I feel, is what's going to stand out most to anyone playing Jade Cocoon for the first time. The game is set in the small forest village of Cyrus, a society that exists in relatively peaceful coexistence with the other denizens of the forest. The player assumes the role of the silent protagonist, Levant. You get to name him at the start of the game, but because Levant is his default name, that's what I'm going to call him here. Anyway, Levant's father, Riquette, was once the Cocoon Master of Cyrus. However, years ago, he vanished without a trace, and Cyrus has been without a Cocoon Master ever since. When the game starts, Cyrus is holding a large festival when the village is attacked by the Onibubu, an army of demonic beasts referred to in-game as the Locusts of the Apocalypse.
I am the lone locust of the apocalypse. Think of me when you look to the night sky.
No, not like that. There we go, that's better. Anyway, Garai, one of Cyrus's wise women, is able to drive the Onibubu out, but in the aftermath, most of the village falls into a mystical sleep that's only able to be cured using the Calibus herb. Unfortunately, the only person who has any leads on the Calibus herb's location is Chorus, a Cocoon Master who lives somewhere in the Beetle Forest. And with Riquette still missing, Cyrus has no Cocoon Master of its own who can brave the journey into the forest to find him. This is, of course, where you come in. Levant is married off to his childhood friend Mabu, thus allowing him to become a full-fledged Cocoon Master and save his village. So there are a couple different aspects of this world I want to focus on. The design and the lore. I'll start with the design, because this honestly is what stands out the most above all else. Put simply, this game looks fantastic. Sure, it doesn't have a Squaresoft-sized budget, but whatever, that's just fine. The game was produced during the height of the PlayStation's love affair with pre-rendered backgrounds, and indeed, there are around 600 of them to feast your eyes on, and all of them look gorgeous. This shouldn't come as a shock to anyone, though, considering the primary designer for this game was none other than Katsuya Kondo. This is probably a name you don't recognize, however, I'm sure most of you are far more familiar with his work than you think. Kondo entered the anime industry in the early 1980s, and very quickly made a name for himself as a key animator on shows like Cat's Eye, the Devilman OVAs, and The Wings of Oniamis, which, in case you didn't know, I made an entire video about as part of my History of Gainax series. But by far, Kondo's most significant contribution is his work with Studio Ghibli. After joining as a key animator for Hayao Miyazaki's Castle in the Sky, Kondo went on to be involved in nearly every one of the studio's major works for the next several decades. My Neighbor Totoro, Kiki's Delivery Service, Pompoko. It's not unfair to say that Kondo's animation talent is an integral facet of the DNA of Ghibli itself. And here's where I need to pause for a second, because I think this is a cause for confusion for a not insignificant amount of people. I've heard Jade Cocoon described more than once as a Studio Ghibli game, and that just is not the case. Ghibli has, throughout their decades-long history, only been officially involved in one, and only one, video game to date, Ni no Kuni: Wrath of the White Witch, and that didn't come out until well over a decade after Jade Cocoon's release. In interviews, Tamura was always quick to disassociate his game from Ghibli, emphasizing that only Kondo was part of the design team. All that being said, I completely understand why people are so quick to credit Ghibli for Jade Cocoon's design work. I mean, all you have to do is take one glance at Kondo's art to be reminded of Ghibli's films, with one above all being the most obvious point of comparison. Princess Mononoke was released to theaters in July of 1997, a year and a half before Jade Cocoon's Japanese debut. It was the most recent Ghibli film to be made at the time of the game's completion, and similarities between the movie and the game seem so obvious that any mention of them seems unnecessary. Kondo was a key animator on Mononoke, and the similarities of design make it seem like he was consciously drawing on that film when working on Jade Cocoon. Interviews with the rest of Genki provide more evidence that the similarities are more than just coincidence. If we pursue the theme of people and nature, we have no choice but to be conscious of Princess Mononoke. You can't help but be affected. And indeed, traces of Princess Mononoke can be found all over this game. Miyazaki's film also feels like a source of inspiration for the social structure of Cyrus, which seems to borrow from both of Mononoke's human civilizations. Its sense of tradition, remoteness, and small size are clear mirrors of the Amishi village, whereas its division of labor, where the men act as cocoon masters and their Nagi wives assist by purifying the cocoons they capture, seems reminiscent of the structure of Irontown, where the women take an active role in the running of the city. Their operation of the bellows is the metaphorical beat that keeps the heart of Irontown pumping, and of course there's the obvious fact that a woman leads the entire city, which is again echoed in Jade Cocoon through the characters of High Priest Garai and Chancellor Jabara. But of course, the closest thematic parallel is the same one mentioned by Genki in the interview I already mentioned, the interaction of people, who in Jade Cocoon are referred to as the beasts of knowledge, and nature, specifically how the two can achieve a sense of harmonious coexistence. The story of Princess Mononoke is literally built around that theme, and so is Jade Cocoon. One thing I respect this game for immensely is that, despite it being a new IP with a pretty short runtime, the devs really seem to go out of their way to construct a phenomenally detailed and lived-in world. The amount of lore is seriously impressive. You pick it up piece by piece as you interact with the people of Cyrus, and there are also entire characters who basically exist to fill in the gaps to any player who's curious enough to listen. Poto is the clearest example of this kind of character. Talking to him at different points will cause him to share the various legends and myths of the world, stories of the forest god Elrim and the lost civilization of Gehenna Pale, among many others. This video is not meant to be a Jade Cocoon lore dump, so I'm not going to cover every story in their entirety, but I do want to briefly cover Poto's first tale, that of Prince Menek. Menek was the heir to the throne of Gehenna Pale, who one day, during a hunting expedition in the forest, finds a mysterious and beautiful woman named Alkana, who seems to have the power to communicate with nature. Menek is enraptured by the woman, regularly returning to the forest to visit her. She, in turn, uses her power to create beautiful silk cloth from the forest cocoons, which is clearly the origin of the present-day system used by the cocoon masters and their wives. Menek's father is overtaken by the silk cloth, and, well, you could probably guess what happens next. Despite Menek's protest, the king exploits the forest for his own greed and kills his son for daring to speak against him. Alkana, on the verge of death, curses men for their greed, and the god Elrim summons the Onibubu, destroying Gehenna Pale. But Elrim's sentence is by no means an unconditionally negative one. He says, "When light is swallowed up by darkness, I shall unleash ruin upon the land," suggesting it is possible for light and darkness to coexist. The return of the Onibubu in the present then asks serious questions. Who or what, for instance, is causing the balance to once again be broken? Aside from the more pressing matters, where can I find the Calibus herb, will the sleeping denizens of Cyrus reawaken, these greater questions always linger on in the background, providing ample incentive for the player to continue onward. And on that note, let's move on to Jade Cocoon's gameplay. The gameplay loop of Jade Cocoon is simple. Move as deep into the forest as you can, capturing or defeating any minions you encounter along the way, and return to Cyrus anytime you need to recover. The forest itself is broken up into 4 different sections, each one locked by a different insect-shaped key, with each subsequent section increasing in size and difficulty. The goal is to get to the heart of each section, which usually leads to a boss fight, and to get there, of course you're going to have to fight, so let's talk about the battle system. Anyone who's played a Pokemon game will find the combat in Jade Cocoon familiar. You encounter a minion, and you summon a minion of your own to fight them. There is, however, one major difference, in that your character can actively participate in battles as well. Levant has his own equipment, as well as his own level separate from that of his minions, which increases not by killing other minions, but by successfully capturing them. The higher your level, the more powerful minions you'll be able to capture. Most of the time, though, you're going to use the minions themselves to fight on your behalf. Again, much like in Pokemon. Also like in Pokemon, each minion has its own elemental affinity, or, as is the case after you begin breeding minions, a mix of elemental affinities. There are 4 elements, as visualized by this square, with their positions suggesting their strengths and weaknesses if a player reads it clockwise. Fire, for instance, is weak to water and is strong to air. So it's always a good idea to, at all times, traverse with minions representing every element, such that you'll always be able to meet your opponents with minions matching their strengths and weaknesses. Use your minions to kill the enemy, and you'll gain experience points, making them stronger. But of course, the ultimate goal is to capture stronger minions, so as long as your current minions are at a decent level, it's best to switch over to Levant and try to capture them. Once an enemy minion's HP is reduced enough, again like in Pokémon, you can try to capture them. This is done not by throwing Pokeballs, but by playing your ocarina. If your capture level is high enough and their HP is low enough, they'll be captured. If not, well, you can bring their HP lower and try again. Thankfully, unlike Pokémon, your ability to capture minions isn't contingent on some expendable resource like Pokeballs, so you can retry your captures as many times as you want. There is, however, a limited number of captured minions you can carry with you at any given time, and once you reach that threshold, you need to return to Cyrus. Thankfully, the game makes this exceptionally easy. You can use an item called the Hunter's Earring to return to the entrance of the forest anytime you're outside of battle, and even if you happen to die in the forest, you don't actually get a game over. In this sense, the game is a lot like Soul Blazer, a game I've also reviewed in the past. I don't necessarily want every RPG I play to do this, but I do admit, every once in a while, it's nice to play something where you can just enjoy what the developers are trying to make without worrying about getting good or any dumb shit like that. Anyway, when you return to Cyrus, your first stop should always be to your wife Mabu. As your partner in crime, she has the invaluable job of purifying your captured cocoons you bring back from the forest. Once they're purified, you can do one of three things. You can choose 3 of them to take back with you to the forest, with the rest of them remaining behind in storage. You can choose to spin them into silk to sell in town, which is the only real way to make money in this game. And finally, and this is where Jade Cocoon gets really in-depth, you can breed them. Minion breeding in Jade Cocoon is, on the surface, relatively simple. You pick one minion to be the base, you pick another to mix it with, and boom, you get a brand new minion. For each pair, you're given the opportunity to review the result, another great way the game respects the player's time. But what's really impressive about this system is the fact that there is, at least in theory, an infinite number of potential new minions you can produce from breeding, and I do mean that literally. Though there are only 171 minions you'll find in the forest during a normal playthrough, through breeding, you have the ability to create brand new minions, and breeding those new minions with other minions can create even newer minions, such that there really is an endless array of minions one could breed. Genki accomplished this in a clever way. Each newly bred minion is generated using the first minion's shape and the second minion's texture. And because the developers designed each minion with the exact same number of polygons, the game can take whatever combination of minions you throw at it and come out with something unique. For a game that came out in 1998, this is seriously impressive, and it's clear that this is a feature that Genki was proud of. Jade Cocoon doesn't have much in the way of side content, but it does have one massive bonus feature in the form of the post-game area called the Eternal Corridor. This is, as the name suggests, a never-ending dungeon where you can encounter both old and new minions and continue breeding them to your heart's content. Admittedly, this kind of content isn't exactly my thing, but I can see the appeal and I respect its inclusion. Anyway, aside from all this, you can also buy and sell items and equipment for Levant, as well as just going around and talking to your fellow villagers. Cyrus is a small place, so Jade Cocoon is one of those games where it's easy and rewarding to keep track of what's going on around the village at all times, get caught up on the world's lore, or just see how everyone's doing, and this is made even more enjoyable in the fact that much of the game's dialogue, 190 minutes worth of it as a matter of fact, is fully voiced. And what's even more shocking about that is that it's actually good. The English dub was primarily done by the husband and wife team of Ellen Stern and Richard Epcar. Yes, that Richard Epcar, as in Bato from Ghost in the Shell and Ziggy from Xenosaga Richard Epcar. These guys have been in the industry for decades, and they bring with them a sense of professionalism that was still largely foreign to the video game voice acting industry of the day. Aside from the two of them also appearing in the dub, Jade Cocoon is probably most notable for being one of the earliest voice acting credits for Michelle Ruff, who would later go on to find fame as the voice of Rukia Kikuchi in Bleach. She's the voice of Mabu. Alright, so now we've come to the point where I have to discuss Jade Cocoon's faults. Thankfully, there aren't that many to talk about, but what problems there are significant enough to warrant discussion. First, and most minor, I have to mention that Jade Cocoon is a game that some of you may have problems getting used to control-wise because, for some reason, Genki decided to use tank controls. Yeah, I realize this was the golden age, if such a term is appropriate, for tank controls. Jade Cocoon and Resident Evil 2 literally came out the exact same year after all. But whereas there's a charm, I think, to using tank controls in a survival horror game, their use in an RPG just feels weird. I mean, were there any other RPGs of that generation that used tank controls like this? Seriously, I can't think of any, so please leave a comment and fill me in if there are in fact any others. The next problem, however, is much more severe, and that has to do with the game's runtime. You can easily finish Jade Cocoon in less than 15 hours, which would have been short during the SNES generation, but for a PlayStation RPG, where games would regularly court the 40-hour mark, that feels like nothing. Now, I have no problems whatsoever with short RPGs. I'm currently in the midst of playing Xenoblade X, and for as fun as I'm having with that game, I'm eagerly looking forward to playing something with a more reasonable double-digit runtime when I'm done. So ordinarily, Jade Cocoon's short length wouldn't be a major issue. My issue comes from the fact that there are a few things that happen at game's end that almost makes me think Jade Cocoon was borderline unfinished. Now, this isn't a spoiler video, so I'm going to be purposely vague here. But at a certain point, Levant has to pass the Trial of the Four Jewels, most of which consists of traversing through the forests of the Netherworld. The forests of the Netherworld are straight-up mirror images of the four forests you've already explored, and given that Cyrus is primarily traversed through menu navigation, that means for the overwhelming majority of the game, you're going to be exploring the same four dungeons over and over again. Without taking anything away from the magnificent environmental design of those forests, this feels really disappointing, and not to mention a drag once you actually enter the forests of the Netherworld. In addition, the very end of the game feels, to be blunt, abrupt to a fault. Like, the immediate conflict is resolved, but there are a number of other plot threads the game doesn't even attempt to wrap up. Hell, you don't even get an actual farewell for most of the other residents of Cyrus. You know, those people you've spent the entirety of the game trying to save. Seriously, this is one of those games where, once the ending credits started to roll, I actually said out loud, fuck no, there's no way that's the end, and sat through the entire credits expecting something to happen afterwards, but no, there was nothing. Now, to be fair, in interviews, the developers did declare their desire to craft a sequel for either the Dreamcast or the PlayStation 2. And indeed, Jade Cocoon 2 would be released for the PS2 in August of 2001. The only thing, though, is I don't know how much Jade Cocoon 2 ties into the original. I admit, I've only played the game once, when I rented it for a week shortly after its American release in December of 2001, so my memory is not doing me any favors here, but I seem to recall it being pretty different both in terms of story and gameplay. Honestly, I'm probably going to replay Jade Cocoon 2 and do a video on it now, if only for my own sanity in resolving this unanswered question. In any case, you're going to have to be okay with the story of Jade Cocoon just kind of ending out of nowhere, which, for a world as lovingly designed as this one, doesn't seem to do the full product justice. If you can get over that, though, Jade Cocoon is more than worth your time. Sadly, the game has never been re-released since the late 90s. In Japan, it's still available for digital purchase on the PS3, but for those of us in the West, outside of its original release, nothing. Thankfully, we live in a time when PlayStation emulation is easier than ever, so by all means, get a ROM, fire up DuckStation, and enjoy. Jade Cocoon was unique enough in its own day, and has only become more unique with the passage of time. Games like this deserve to be remembered.